Matthew Collins stepped out of the Reading Supply Depot and into the rain, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. The evening shift had just wrapped up, and the warehouse was silent except for the steady hum of trucks cooling down after a long day. He scanned the parking lot as he always did, ensuring everything was in order. That's when he saw him. The man was sitting on an overturned milk crate near the edge of the lot, his head bent low and his hands wrapped around a paper cup. His jacket was threadbare, and his shoes looked like they'd barely survived the storm. Matthew paused, unsure whether to walk past or say something. "Hey there," he finally called out, his voice firm but not unkind. The man looked up, startled. His face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp, taking in Matthew's suit jacket and clipboard. "Evening," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You all right?" Matthew asked, stepping closer. The man gave a dry chuckle and gestured at his surroundings. "Been better." Matthew shifted his weight, unsure what to say. He wasn't the type to meddle in strangers' business, but something about this man gave him pause. "You got a name?" "Daniel." "Daniel Hartman," the man replied. "Just passing through." Matthew glanced at the backpack beside him, its straps frayed and patched with duct tape. "Been passing through for a while." Daniel shrugged. "Long enough." The rain started to pick up, and Matthew pulled out his keys, feeling the urge to leave. But something stopped him. Instead, he nodded toward the warehouse. "Wait here a second." Daniel watched as Matthew disappeared back inside. When he returned a few minutes later, he handed Daniel a sandwich and a steaming cup of coffee. "Figured you could use this." For a moment, Daniel stared at the offering like he didn't know whether to accept it. Then he took the cup with a quiet thanks. Matthew lingered, watching as Daniel ate in silence. The man had a quiet dignity about him, despite his circumstances. "What do you do, Daniel?" "I was a mechanic," Daniel said between bites. "Good with my hands. Used to run my own shop before. Well, before things went south." Matthew nodded but didn't press for details. "You looking for work?" Daniel laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That's not easy when you don't have an address." The word struck a chord with Matthew. He'd always believed in second chances, even if he rarely acted on it. For years, he'd watched resumes pile up on his desk, most of them tossed aside because they didn't fit the mold. Maybe it was time to change that. "I might have something for you," he said. Daniel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We've got a position open in the warehouse," Matthew explained. "It's labor-intensive moving crates, loading trucks, but it's steady work." Daniel hesitated, his hands tightening around the coffee cup. "I don't know if I'm your guy. Been out of the game a while." "Everyone's out of the game until they're back in," Matthew replied. "You want it or not." Daniel studied him, searching for any hint of pity or condescension, but all he saw was a man making an offer. Finally, he nodded. "I'll take it." Matthew extended his hand and Daniel shook it, his grip firm despite the cold. "Be here tomorrow at 7 a.m. Sharp. Don't make me regret this." "I won't," Daniel promised. The next morning, Daniel arrived early, his breath visible in the crisp air. He stood outside the warehouse, nervously shifting his weight as employees filed past, some giving him curious glances. Inside, Matthew introduced Daniel to the team, keeping the explanation brief. "This is Daniel. He'll be helping out on the floor. Show him the ropes." The work was grueling. Daniel spent the day hauling crates, organizing pallets, and trying to keep up with the rhythm of the warehouse. By lunch, his muscles ached, and he was drenched in sweat, but he refused to slow down. Not everyone was welcoming. Jake, a senior employee known for his sharp tongue, smirked as Daniel struggled to stack a heavy load. "You sure this guy can handle it, boss?" he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Daniel kept his head down, focusing on the task. He wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him fail. By the end of the day, he could barely lift his arms. But when Matthew passed by, giving him an approving nod, Daniel felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, as Daniel sat on the edge of the cot in the shelter where he'd been staying, he replayed the day in his mind. The work was hard, and the stares from some of the staff stung, but for the first time in months he felt like he was moving forward. Matthew, meanwhile, couldn't shake the thought of Daniel's determined expression. Maybe he'd made the right choice after all. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Daniel as he adjusted to life at the warehouse. Each morning he arrived early, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor as he prepared for another day of lifting, organizing, and loading. The work was tough, but he tackled it with quiet determination, refusing to let fatigue or doubt get the better of him. Some of the employees warmed up to him quickly, impressed by his dedication. Luis, a forklift operator with a knack for telling jokes, started sharing his lunch breaks with Daniel, their conversations drifting between sports, music, and life before the warehouse. Others, like Jake, remained skeptical, occasionally throwing out sarcastic comments that Daniel chose to ignore. One afternoon, as the team unloaded a shipment of heavy machinery parts, Jake's taunts escalated. "Hey, new guy," he called out, his voice carrying across the floor. "Think you can manage without dropping something today?" Daniel glanced at him, his face calm but his hands gripping the crate a little tighter. Luis shot Jake a look. "Give it a rest, man. He's doing fine." Jake shrugged, smirking. "Just saying. Wouldn't want the boss to regret his charity case." The words stung, but Daniel kept moving, focusing on the rhythm of the work. By the time the shift ended, his back ached, and his arms felt like lead, but he was proud of what he'd accomplished. Later that evening, as the warehouse emptied out, Matthew called Daniel into his office. The small room was cluttered with stacks of papers and a whiteboard filled with schedules and deadlines. Matthew motioned for him to sit. "You're doing good work," Matthew said, leaning back in his chair. "I've noticed." Daniel nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thanks. I'm just trying to keep up." "You're doing more than that," Matthew replied. He paused, tapping a pen against his desk. "Look, I know Jake's been giving you a hard time. Don't let it get to you. He'll come around eventually, or he won't. Either way, just keep showing up and doing what you're doing." Daniel smiled faintly, appreciating the words more than he let on. "I will." Matthew leaned forward, his expression softening. "You've been here a month now. How are things outside of work? You got a place to stay?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Still at the shelter. It's not ideal, but it works for now." Matthew nodded, his gaze steady. "If you need anything, gear for work, transportation, whatever, let me know. I can't promise much, but I'll do what I can." For a moment, Daniel was struck by the sincerity in Matthew's voice. He hadn't expected this level of concern from someone like him, a man who ran the warehouse with an almost military efficiency. "I appreciate that," Daniel said quietly. "All right," Matthew said, standing up. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another big day." Daniel left the office feeling a little lighter, the weight of his situation momentarily eased by the knowledge that someone believed in him. As the weeks turned into months, the pieces of Daniel's life slowly began to fall into place. He saved every penny he could, eating modest meals and avoiding unnecessary expenses. On his days off, he visited the public library, using their computers to search for affordable housing and catch up on the latest developments in the auto industry, a world he hadn't touched since his shop closed. One day, while scrolling through classified ads, he stumbled upon a listing for a garage space available for rent. The price was steep, but the location was ideal, nestled in a neighborhood with plenty of potential customers. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to imagine the possibility of starting over, of returning to the work he loved. But he knew he wasn't ready yet. The warehouse job was his lifeline, and he couldn't afford to jeopardize it. So he tucked the dream away, focusing on building a stable foundation first. At the warehouse, his reputation continued to grow. Even Jake had softened, offering the occasional grunt of approval when Daniel expertly handled a tricky load or stayed late to finish a shipment. Luis started calling him the Machine, a nickname that spread among the team. Matthew watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He had taken a gamble on Daniel, and it was paying off. But more than that, he felt a sense of pride not in himself, but in Daniel's resilience and determination. One evening, as the team gathered in the break room after a particularly grueling day, Matthew walked in carrying a box of donuts. "Good work today, everyone," he said, setting the box on the table. "Grab one before Jake eats them all." The team laughed, and Daniel found himself smiling, feeling for the first time like he belonged. As he bit into a glazed donut, he thought about how far he'd come since that rainy night outside the warehouse. It wasn't easy, and there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The months rolled on, and Daniel's progress became impossible to ignore. He'd become an integral part of the warehouse team, his work ethic and quiet determination earning the respect of nearly everyone. Even Jake, who had been the most vocal skeptic, had stopped with his jabs and started nodding in approval whenever Daniel expertly loaded pallets or stayed late to help complete an order. But as much as Daniel valued his job at the warehouse, he hadn't forgotten his dream of returning to his roots as a mechanic. On weekends, he began using his savings to buy second-hand tools and small auto parts, slowly rebuilding an inventory he could use in the future. One Saturday, he visited the garage space he'd seen listed months earlier. The sign was still up, though the building looked even more worn down than he'd remembered. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were streaked with grime, but Daniel could see potential in the large bay doors and the spacious interior. The landlord, an older man named Carl, met him there. "You're the first person to take an interest in this place in a while," Carl said, jingling a set of keys as they walked inside. "You thinking of opening a shop?" Eventually, Daniel said, running his hand along the workbench covered in a fine layer of dust. "It's going to take time, though. I'll need to fix it up first." Carl shrugged. "As long as you pay the rent on time, I don't care what you do with it." The last tenant ran it as a repair shop too. Might even find some stuff they left behind in the storage room. Daniel signed the lease that day. It was a risk one that ate into his carefully saved money, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was the right move. Over the next few months, he poured every spare hour into transforming the garage. He spent his evenings after work cleaning, painting, and repairing the space. On weekends, he bought equipment and supplies, carefully budgeting every purchase. The warehouse team began to notice his long hours and the faint grease stains that occasionally appeared on his hands. Luis teased him one day during lunch. "What's the deal, man? You moonlighting as a superhero or something?" Daniel chuckled. "Something like that." Matthew overheard the exchange but didn't press for details. He'd learned that Daniel was a private man, and he respected that. Still, he couldn't help but feel curious about what Daniel was working toward. One Friday evening, as the team wrapped up for the week, Matthew pulled Daniel aside. "You've been putting in a lot of hours lately," he said. "You sure you're not overloading yourself?" Daniel hesitated, then decided to share a little. "I've been working on something outside of here. Fixing up a garage. Hoping to get it running as a mechanic shop someday." Matthew raised his eyebrows, impressed. "That's ambitious." "Yeah," Daniel admitted. "But it's what I know. It's where I belong." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if anyone can pull it off, it's you. Let me know if you need a hand with anything." The offer caught Daniel off guard, but he smiled and thanked Matthew, appreciating the gesture more than he let on. As the year mark of his time at the warehouse approached, Daniel finally finished the renovations on the garage. He registered the business under the name Hartman Auto Repair and placed a modest ad in the local paper. His first customers trickled in, a single mom needing her brakes replaced, a young couple with an overheating engine, and word of his reliable, affordable service began to spread. Balancing the demands of the warehouse job and the garage was exhausting. But Daniel pushed through, knowing he was building a future he could be proud of. One evening, as he closed up the garage after a long day, he sat at his desk and looked over his finances. For the first time in years, he felt truly stable. He had enough saved to cover expenses for the shop, and his personal debts were nearly paid off. It was time to take the next step. The following Monday, Daniel arrived at the warehouse as usual, but instead of heading straight to the loading docks, he knocked on Matthew's office door. "Got a minute?" Daniel asked when Matthew looked up. "Sure," Matthew said, motioning for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you for everything. When you hired me, I was at rock bottom. This job gave me the chance to get back on my feet, and I'll always be grateful for that." Matthew frowned slightly. "You make it sound like you're saying goodbye." "I am," Daniel said with a small smile. "The garage is up and running now. I've got enough customers to keep me busy full-time. It's time for me to move on." Matthew leaned back in his chair, absorbing the news. "Well, I can't say I'm happy to lose you, but I'm proud of you, Daniel. You've earned this." Before leaving, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "There's one more thing," he said, placing it on Matthew's desk. "What's this?" Matthew asked, picking it up. "Call it a thank you gift," Daniel said. "You didn't have to take a chance on me, but you did. That made all the difference." Matthew opened the envelope to find a check for $2,500. He stared at it, speechless. "I've been setting aside a little every month," Daniel explained. "Figured it was the least I could do." Matthew shook his head, pushing the envelope back toward Daniel. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Daniel said firmly. "You believed in me when no one else would. You earned it." Reluctantly, Matthew accepted the check, feeling a rare lump in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly. Daniel stood, extending his hand. "No, thank you." As they shook hands, Matthew felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he had played a small part in helping Daniel rebuild his life. After leaving the warehouse, Daniel fully immersed himself in running Hartman Auto Repair. Business picked up quickly as word spread about the honest mechanic who treated customers with care and respect. Families came in for routine maintenance, young drivers sought advice on their first cars, and even seasoned car enthusiasts trusted Daniel with their prized vehicles. The garage became a community hub in the neighborhood, a place where people felt welcome. Daniel hired a few employees, choosing them carefully not just for their skills, but for their character. One of his first hires was a young man named Eric, who reminded Daniel of himself a few years ago, talented but struggling to find his footing after a rough patch in life. Eric worked tirelessly, eager to prove himself. Daniel took him under his wing, teaching him everything from engine repairs to managing customer relationships. One evening, after finishing a particularly tricky job, Eric leaned against the workbench, wiping grease from his hands. "Thanks for giving me a shot," Eric said. "Not a lot of people would've." Daniel smiled, recognizing the same gratitude he had felt toward Matthew. "Everyone deserves a chance," he replied. "Just make the most of it." The garage's success didn't erase the hard times Daniel had been through, but it gave him a sense of purpose and stability he hadn't felt in years. He often thought about the warehouse and the pivotal moment when Matthew had offered him that first job. One day, while sorting through invoices, Daniel came across the folder where he kept his old work boots and the ID badge he'd worn at Reading Supply Depot. The sight of them brought back memories of early mornings in the warehouse, the camaraderie of the team, and the lessons he'd learned. He decided to pay a visit. It was a crisp autumn morning when Daniel walked through the familiar gates of the warehouse. The place was as bustling as ever, with forklifts buzzing and workers calling out to one another. Daniel spotted Luis first, who did a double take before breaking into a grin. "Daniel. Look at you," Luis said, clapping him on the back. "We miss having you around here." I miss you guys too, Daniel replied. How's everything been? Same old grind, Luis said with a chuckle. Jake's still Jake, but he doesn't give anyone grief anymore. You broke him in for the rest of us. They laughed, and Daniel felt a wave of nostalgia. As they chatted, Matthew emerged from his office, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise as he saw Daniel. Daniel Hartman, Matthew said, shaking his hand firmly. What brings you back? I just wanted to stop by and say thanks again, Daniel said. The garage is doing great, and I wouldn't be where I am without this place or without you. Matthew waved it off, though a hint of pride flickered in his eyes. You did the work, Daniel. I just opened the door. They spent a few minutes catching up, with Matthew asking about the garage and Daniel asking about the warehouse. Before leaving, Daniel handed Matthew a small envelope. What's this? Matthew asked, eyeing it warily. Don't worry. It's not another check, Daniel said with a laugh. Just a few free service vouchers for the garage. Bring your car in anytime, it's on me. Matthew chuckled and tucked the envelope into his pocket. I might just take you up on that. As Daniel walked back to his truck, he felt a deep sense of closure. He had come full circle, from rock bottom to rebuilding his life, and now he could give back to those who had helped him along the way. Back at the garage, Daniel hung his old work boots on the wall above his desk as a reminder of where he'd started. They were scuffed and worn, but to him, they represented something far greater: the chance he'd been given, and the life he'd built because of it. The days continued to pass, and Hartman Auto Repair thrived. Customers became regulars, employees grew into their roles, and Daniel found joy in both the work and the community he had created. Years later, when a young man walked into the garage looking for a job, nervous and unsure, Daniel smiled. He saw something familiar in the young man's eyes: the same determination, the same hunger for a fresh start. You looking for work? Daniel asked, extending his hand. The young man nodded. Yeah. I'll work hard, I promise. Daniel shook his hand firmly. All right, let's get started. And just like that, another chapter began. Daniel's decision to hire the young man marked the start of something that extended beyond Hartman Auto Repair. Over the next few years, the garage became more than just a business. It became a second chance for others who needed it, just like Daniel had. The young man, whose name was Marcus, proved to be a quick learner. At first, Marcus fumbled through tasks, apologizing profusely whenever he made a mistake. But Daniel saw potential in him and took the time to teach him the intricacies of auto repair. Slowly but surely, Marcus gained confidence, and before long, he was tackling jobs on his own with pride. One evening, as they were locking up, Marcus hesitated by the door. Daniel, he said, his voice uncertain, why'd you take a chance on me? You didn't even know me. Daniel paused, his hand resting on the key in the lock. He thought about Matthew, the warehouse, and all the people who had helped him rebuild his life. Because someone once took a chance on me, Daniel said. It's my turn to pass that on. The words stayed with Marcus. A year later, when he saved enough money to buy a used car, a clunky sedan with more character than reliability, he brought it into the shop with a wide grin. It's not much, Marcus said, but it's mine. Daniel helped him fix it up, teaching him along the way. When Marcus drove it out of the bay for the first time, his grin was infectious, and Daniel felt a deep satisfaction, knowing he had played a part in helping Marcus find stability and pride. Meanwhile, Daniel's reputation continued to grow. Customers would often leave glowing reviews, praising not only the quality of the work but the honesty and warmth of the garage. Local community groups began reaching out, asking if Daniel could help train young people looking to learn a trade. Daniel agreed, and Hartman Auto Repair started hosting workshops on weekends. Teenagers and young adults, many of whom had struggled to find direction, came to learn the basics of car maintenance. Daniel watched as their confidence grew with every bolt tightened and every engine started. One day, during a particularly busy workshop, Daniel looked around the garage and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The tools on the walls, the hum of activity, The faces of people working toward something better. It was everything he had dreamed of during those nights spent in the shelter, wondering if life would ever turn around. He often thought about Matthew and the warehouse during moments like these. One afternoon he decided to stop by again, this time with Marcus tagging along. The warehouse was as lively as ever when they arrived. Luis spotted them first, his face lighting up as he hurried over. "Daniel. Back again? Thought you were too busy being famous." Daniel laughed and shook his hand. "Not famous, just busy. Thought I'd drop by and see how things are." Matthew emerged from the office a moment later, his expression softening into a rare smile when he saw Daniel. "Twice in 1 year? You're spoiling us?" "This place still feels like home," Daniel admitted. Marcus looked around, taking in the towering shelves and the steady rhythm of the warehouse floor. "So, this is where it all started for you?" Daniel nodded. "This is where it started turning around." Matthew clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "And look where you are now. You've done good, Daniel, real good." "I owe a lot of that to you," Daniel said. "You gave me the chance to prove myself when no one else would." Matthew waved him off with a grin. "Don't go getting sentimental on me. You earned every bit of it." As they left the warehouse, Marcus turned to Daniel. "I get it now," he said. "Why you gave me a shot. It's about paying it forward." Daniel smiled. "Exactly. And one day you'll do the same for someone else." Over the years, Hartman Auto Repair became a cornerstone of the community. Daniel continued to hire those who needed a fresh start, offering not just jobs but mentorship and support. When Daniel finally retired, he passed the garage on to Marcus, who had grown from an unsure young man into a skilled and confident mechanic. On the day Daniel handed over the keys, Marcus promised to carry on the legacy. "I'll make sure this place stays what you built it to be," he said. "I know you will," Daniel replied. As Daniel walked away, he felt no sadness, only pride. He had built something lasting, something that mattered. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness, a chance offered by one man to another.